Welcome to Lair the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, 10 bands that always make me think of the 70s. Bands that I associate with the 70s, quintessential 70s bands for me. Now, these are not necessarily bands that only existed in the 70s. Many of these bands went on to have albums through the 80s and everything. And this is not a list of my favorite albums from the 70s or my favorite bands from the 70s. These are just bands. When I think of these bands, when I hear these bands, it makes me think of the 70s. It's just what comes to me. I associate these bands with the 70s. And some of it just has to do with when I heard these artists, maybe the album that I heard from them. So there's bands, for instance, like that were active in the 70s. For instance, Black Sabbath. But I don't just associate the 70s with Black Sabbath, because Black Sabbath went on, have Ronnie James Dio in the band in the 80s, went on to, do all kinds of stuff through the 80s and 90s. So I don't think of Black Sabbath just as a 70s band. But these bands, and I think you'll get the idea what I mean here, that these bands are bands that when I think of them, I think of the 70s. A good example for the 80s would be like Michael Jackson. When I think of Thriller and Michael Jackson, that to me is like the 80s. It was just such an important album in the 80s. It just sort of represents, makes me think of the 80s whenever the videos, the early days of MTV, him in the soda commercials and stuff like that. All right, and I tried to pick the albums that kind of most remind me or make me think of the 70s when it comes to these particular bands. All right, so number one for me here is, these are in no particular order. Sweet, Desolation, Boulevard. Love this album. Kind of surprising I haven't done a video on this yet. Great glam hard rock. When I think of glam hard rock, I really think of the 70s. And this album for me just screams the 70s. The hair, the platform boots, just everything about it. When I hear this, I first got this. I had an uncle that gave me a box of 8 tracks in like probably 80, 81. So there was a ton of 70s stuff in here. So not only do I think of the 70s when I think of the Sweet in this album, I think of 8 tracks because I can distinctly remember hearing this and listening to this over and over on 8-track. All right, so the Sweet. All right, here's another one. This is sort of like a quintessential 70s live hard rock album for me. I've done a video on this, Cheap Trick at Budokan. Cheap Trick in general reminds me of the 70s. Now, I know they went on to put out other albums, of course, after the 70s, but when I think of Cheap Trick, I think of the 70s. Part of that, too, has to do with, has anybody seen the movie Over the Edge? It's sort of like a teen angst movie. These kids in the late 70s in this town, they land up burning the place to the ground. And I think it's Matt Dillon, I think, is in it. There's a lot of Cheap Trick in that movie, and so that always reminds me. Cheap Trick makes me think of that movie, which is like a real 70s teen angst type movie. So I always associate Cheap Trick, especially this album, and probably Dream Police too, I would say, with the 70s. All right, here's another guy that makes me think of the 70s all the time, is Alice Cooper. I think it's because Alice's favorite albums for me all came out in the 70s. And Alice reminds me of, he makes me think of late night, Friday night, Saturday night, and those horror movie TV show hosts. Like, does anybody know Sven Gulli? That there would be a host, he would show B-rate horror, campy horror movies. And for some reason, Alice just always reminds me of that, because he has that sort of horror, 70s horror shtick to the way he does his things. So this album, love this album, done a video on this album. Alice always makes me think of the 70s. All right, here's another band, and this is because of radio. Radio plays basically every song on this record like crazy. I've done a video on it, and that's Boston. Quintessential 70s hard rock band, maybe. I mean, there's just so many songs on here, More Than a Feeling, all that kind of stuff, Hitch a Ride, etc., etc. And when I hear this band, I know that they released some albums in the 80s and everything, but for me, and in the 90s, but for me, this is the album and it just sort of represents that sort of mid-late 70s, fantastic 70s hard rock, very well produced, great playing and everything. And you know, when I was growing up, when I was in high school, I'm of an interesting age that it was like when I was in high school, there were a ton of people that were into classic rock, stuff like all this stuff I'm showing here. But yet there was this new stuff coming out in the 80s, like the MTV, that, you know, Twisted Sister, Rat, Dokken, Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Ozzy Solo, all that stuff, Black Sabbath. But so I was listening to a lot of this stuff, plus I was listening to what was happening in the 80s. So I had a really interesting mix, and I think that's why I have such a fondness for this sort of 70s era. It was like being played on the radio constantly. If there were local cover bands, this is the stuff that they were playing. My friends, their older brothers, this is what they were cranking on their stereos, stuff like this. All right, another band that makes me always think of the 70s is Leonard Skynyrd, Freebird, right? It's the ultimate anthem of the 70s, maybe, at least up there in the top 5. Played like crazy on classic rock, tons of their songs, you know, you hear all the time. And again, when I was in high school, I remember there was a kid that was totally into Leonard Skynyrd, and you know, if we were at a party or something, he'd be cranking up Leonard Skynyrd, and so it was something that I just heard a lot. All right, here I think this band, their output was all, I'm pretty much sure it was all in the 70s. I can't remember if Coda came out maybe in 1980, but the bulk of pretty much all their stuff came out in the 70s, and that's Led Zeppelin. And this album, Stairway to Heaven, I mentioned Freebird. Stairway to Heaven, you know, maybe the ultimate classic rock radio song from the 70s gets played. This album in general, it was just so huge. Rock and roll, Stairway to Heaven, just everything on this record. And it sort of, again, encapsulates that slightly experimental nature of the 70s, where bands were pushing the boundaries a little bit, bringing in all these different influences, like the folky influences and the acoustic influences that you hear on this. All right, here's a big one. This just screams 70s. Bat Out of Hell, Meatloaf. I remember when I would visit my grandparents' house on my dad's side, he had lots of brothers and sisters, and he had a brother that was a fair bit younger than him, so he was a teenager in the 70s, and his room, he had this sort of like sitting on a rack or something, you know, and every time I would go upstairs to go to the bathroom, I'd peek in the room and I would see this cover, and I remember thinking that the album was going to be really heavy. I remember being disappointed when I first heard it. I thought it was going to be like a metal record. But over the years, this has grown on me. It is a fantastic album, maybe overplayed, but I do really like it. And for me, it just screams, you know, the 70s. Meatloaf, you know, being in the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I don't remember when Rocky Horror came out, but that's a very 70s feeling movie. If it didn't come out in the 70s, I think it came out in the early 80s. But just an album that screams 70s for me. All right, now here's an example of a band that did go on to release. They're still out there. They released a lot of albums in the 80s and 90s, even into the 2000s. I might get a little slack for this, but for me, when I think of this band, they really, really represent the 70s for me, and that's Kiss, especially this album. I've told the story a million times. My uncle, that was only 10 years older than me, was really into Kiss. So in the 70s there, I was listening to his records. I remember Kiss Meets the Phantom, and just the whole thing, you know. And so for me, it just really, really takes me back to the 70s. This is Kiss at their peak. For me, was in the 70s when they were at the peak of their popularity and what they were doing musically. So just for me, it just brings back really early memories of first discovering music there in like 77, 78. I've told this story. It didn't get a lot of views, but go back and check it out. I can't remember what I titled it. It was something like My Memories of Kiss or something like that. And I talked about how when I was little, I had a neighbor that had a teenage son. So this would have been like 76, 77, right when Kiss was huge. And he played drums, and his room was in the basement of his house. So the window to his room was on the ground level outside his house. And he would He had Kiss posters all over his wall. He would crank up his stereo and play his drums along to Kiss records, and all the kids would roll in on their big wheels and stuff like that. We would just sit there outside his window listening to him jamming on drums to Kiss records. And he had the ultimate 70s bedroom, you know, a fishnet thing on his ceiling, black lights, fire engine, like a light thing and everything. And so that's another reason why when I think of Kiss, I think of that time. And, you know, this was before MTV, and it was exciting. You didn't get to hear people playing instruments a lot. So to hear somebody jamming out on drums to Kiss records, that was a big deal. And there'd be 20, 30 kids from the neighborhood piled outside his window, taking turns looking in to watch him play. All right, Frampton Comes Alive. Again, these are not my favorite albums from the 70s. This certainly, it's an okay record. But man, this was like such a huge hit in the 70s. I'm not sure. I know he put out other albums, but this is the album you always think of when you think of Peter Frampton. One of the first big like live albums, sort of kicked off the whole double live album thing in some ways. So when I think of Peter Frampton and, you know, those songs that Talkbox sing, I think of the 70s. All right, my last one is Fleetwood Mac. Fleetwood Mac, again, they just got played a lot in the 70s. I could have also put Steely Dan in here. I sort of lumped those two bands together for some reason, although they're not really that similar. But to me, it's just sort of quintessential 70s, sort of mellow rock, if you will. I didn't dive too much into the mellow rock stuff, and I wasn't able to appreciate this stuff till years later. You know, early on when I was younger, everything had to have heavy, hard guitar in it, or I wasn't into it. But, you know, I've come to appreciate this kind of stuff, and when I hear this, it just really makes me think of the 70s and guys spending $500,000 making records. And, you know, I saw an interview with Skunk Baxter, the guitar player who was with, I believe, Steely Dan, right? And he was talking about how the massive budgets that they had in the 70s. And he said, man, I would spend an entire week in a $500 an hour studio just trying to find a comfortable chair to sit in. And I thought, you know, that's just like what the 70s was about, just this excess, tons of money, sinking tons of money into recordings. And Fleetwood Mac always makes me think of that. Super well produced records. You can tell they spend a lot of time and a lot of money on these things. So for me, it's kind of a very 70s band. All right, there you go. Let me know some bands for you that make you think of the 70s. Again, doesn't have to be your favorite bands or your favorite albums, but let me know some albums, some bands that when you hear them, when you think of those bands, you just think of the 70s. All right, leave it in the comments down below. Till we see you again, make sure you rock hard, ride free.